So, have you had a good time? Did you learn something? A little bit, I hope, right? I thought a little bit of food for thought. What we want to do is not necessarily try and bring it all together, but we want to try and help you focus on some of the issues. Where do we go from here? And it's very interesting. Obviously, you know, there's lots of emotional ideas that people have about leadership, about the style of what America in particular is doing, and the response that that triggers across the world. But let's focus on US-Japan. Generally, a great sense of optimism about the future, but let's focus on SWOT. What are the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats, both for Japan and the United States of America? Now, SWOT is 4 letters. It's good 4 letters, right? And quickly, we're going to go a little bit through, for both Japan and America, biggest strengths.
For Japan, I would say it's soft power and its attractiveness. And I think we've heard about that at different times during the day. But just on many levels, Japan is very, very attractive. And for the U.S. strength, I would say it's its innovation culture and, yeah, innovation culture.
So innovation culture and soft power Japan. Okay. I thought you were going to say baseball. But
Part of soft power.
Who's got better baseball players now? I'm not sure. That's debatable. So I would say on the strength side for the U.S., it's still scale. Earlier we talked about the monetary policy and the sort of centralness that America still has. I think it's probably the biggest strength. For Japan, I'm going to state the strength as a negative, which is it's not as divisive. And across most of developed countries, there's so much just sort of paralysis that's occurring both at a political and broader because of that divisiveness. And we talked about that a little bit this morning from our view from the, was it the crisis of Washington? No, the chaos in Washington. And I think that phenomenon is a great strength Japan has, which I think it can act in a cohesive way.
right, fantastic. Again.
Let me talk about Japanese weakness. That is Japanese style.
This is Japanese. Hi, dozo.
Okay. So 3 days ago, I arrived United States, and I met so many people, exchange information, the CEO and visited some companies. I really felt the differences of the level of urgency for this Middle East crisis. My point is the U.S. is a really lucky country. You have the world's largest crude oil supplier nowadays. And Japan, as you know, the 90% relying on the Middle East. And, Takaichi government keeps saying, oh, we have the sufficient amount of oil, so until next year. But the real problem is NAFTA. NAFTA is the raw material for the ethylene cracking. By the way, Lotte is one of the largest chemical company in Asia. So we already stopped some of the factory, and then we already see some of the company difficult to maintain the business. And I think maybe within 1 month, 2 months, some of the small company will go bankrupt in Japan. India is much, much worse. About already 40–50% of the plastic-related companies stopped operation. We have the quite big factory, ice cream factory. We cannot get package already. So it's happening here and there. So to me, it's wake-up call for Japan. We should realize this really, risky situation and vulnerability in terms of the self-sufficiency and self-defense. So this is really timing. From the morning for those sessions, we talk about redefining. So how Japan should redesign for self-defense and self-sufficiency. Those are my main concern at the moment.
Right. Okay, for 30 seconds, the biggest strength.
Very good worker.
Very good water.
Employees really, serious
Oh,
and
they right.
come to job on time and so on. And the manufacturing capability, high quality, and we do have the consensus-based management, but it's changing a lot. Especially, we have many startups coming up, and corporate style is changing a lot. So we now have the fundamental strengths, and we do have the quite interesting leadership, especially among the young people. So it's changing a lot. So we have the fundamental things in terms of technology, manufacturing capability, those things, and combined with new type of the management is good sign.
Right.
Am I answering the question?
You for Japanese men, you're starting to make progress, to be a little bit optimistic, about your country. I think Japan's biggest strength is trust. I think everything else can be bought. You cannot buy trust. And Japan is very good at buying things, at innovating as a second mover, right? Adopting, making things smaller, making it better for the customer. But the big defining factor is that nobody in the world trusts the two superpowers. You don't trust Mr. Xi Jinping. You do not trust the current White House. And as a result of that, Japan's role as a potential mediator, what I call Pax Nipponica, that is actually very real if only the Japanese men would have a bit more confidence in their own country. Weakness.
Well, I would just say for Japan, risk-taking is the weakness I would point out. And on the U.S., it's our right now our ability to be relied on globally in many places, but it's our national presence right now.
Right. Okay.
I'll start with Japan. I think one of the strengths that Japan has become a weakness. And I think Japan needs to innovate and change at a faster rate. And I think there's a lot of examples which we really like to point to where we're seeing moments of innovation. We see some venture capitalists out there, just a few of them, like at Globus. But it's really the exception. And I think the country needs to sort of mobilize more aggressively. I'm optimistic that it will happen, but I see that as the biggest challenge or weakness. For the U.S., I think it's the opposite. We've lost our soul. If you think about what the company was founded on and the principles, and we've gone back in a very insular way. And this concept of America first, which I think could have been a positive concept, has become one of the most negative concepts, I think, at scale we've ever had in the world. And it's, I'm not going to go back and talk about all the worst places in the world where we've had those problems, but you can guess some of them. So I'd say that is the biggest weakness. And again, the reason I'm heartened a little bit, I believe that's an administration-centric, not completely, but administration-centric problem, and we will be able to cycle out of that weakness.
Right. I'm very grateful for you to talk about soul, in the sense of that, there's a lot of day-to-day things, very transactional things that are going on, but the bigger zeitgeist, sorry, I'm German, you have to do this, the bigger forces that are going on, there's obviously a change going on that we don't quite touch, and, the fact that there is an aspirational loss. Again, I don't think anybody can really answer, well, what are you fighting for in Iran? It's not clear what that actually is.
Saving face. At this point, it's saving face.
Well, no, but so it morphs into a daily thing where you're basically paranoid or psychotic, depending on your point of view. You did weakness already, right?
Yeah. You didn't give us a U.S. weakness.
I speak about the strengths too.
And you speak about strengths.
Yeah.
And what about America from your perspective?
Scale.
That is obviously a weakness.
Resource. Diversity.
Diversity, also a weakness. I mean, I'm just saying.
I think the quite strong triangle among the corporation, startup to large mid-scale company and the academics. I'm not sure about the government, but at least academia and the corporation enterprise is really good tie.
Right.
So those are the maybe strengths.
Right.
United States.
It's very interesting, right? Because this ability to move fast and break things, America as the innovation powerhouse, America being the land of opportunity, which still very much is the case, right? You'd be kind of mad to set up a startup in Japan as opposed to setting up a startup in the United States. That's why many of you, are here, and, any advice as a venture capitalist that you give to any Japan-based startup is the first advice is start thinking America, start thinking global, right? Get out of this insularity. On this point of risk-taking, it's very interesting because I'm always nayanderu. I'm always confused about the whole, because I actually think Japan takes a lot of risks, right? When you think about it, when Elon Musk started to challenge cars by basically saying your operating system is broken, we're going to do electric cars. And Toyota basically saying, well, that's actually stupid from an engineering perspective because other technologies like hydrogen, right, are actually going to be much more efficient, from an engineering perspective in sort of translating energy into mobility. An EV is a suboptimal, very much so, solution. Right? And Toyota basically made this big bet and saying, no, we're not going to make this big bet on this, right? And as a result of that, right, you have Japan having one of the lowest diffusion rates of electric vehicles. Now, it's the protection of an incumbent, there's no question, but it's not as though Toyota is lazy and not trying to push the engineering envelope, which they are doing at the same time. So it's quite interesting. Right? I once had a discussion with Mr. Toyota, and he basically said, it's like, we just want to be the fastest second mover. Just very interesting, right? So you've got this, like, let the Americans do the dirty work, right? And we basically adopt and perfect it so that it actually works, right? Now, strengths, weaknesses, that was easy, right? I hope it was a little fun. Opportunities.
So I would say the space economy.
The space economy. Oh, you're moving out.
And, I don't pretend by any stretch to be an expert on it. But when I've been out, hearing people talk about it, and it hasn't really come up today in the conversations that I've been in, I just find it's fascinating to think about the on-orbit economy, using the moon and using space differently, civilians living in space, and the opportunities for science in space. So again, I'm not an expert on the area, but I'm recently quite taken with the opportunities, and I think it's an opportunity for both of our countries, and it's, Japan is seen as having a great role in space leadership, and space is an area where we have to cooperate together. So,
So wonderful. So the opportunity is actually a new frontier, right? A new Wild West.
For opportunity, I wish I had one that crossed over. That was very clever, and I don't have that. But, for Japan, it's, I think, very clear to me one of the biggest opportunities. If you are the third largest economy, and I would say the third most important on a more macro way, country, and the number one and the number two, whichever way you want to rank them, are acting in ways that are challenging to understand, at least to me, and aggressive towards many, many other places, I think it's an incredibly powerful position to be in. And I think Japan has an opportunity, if more aggressive in asserting its prominence globally, to take a much bigger role in the world. So I think that is a dramatic opportunity that has recently been created. For the US, I think it's still probably going to be technology, particularly with the acceleration of AI technology, and so much of it that's meaningful is centered still in the US, where the leadership is. And I think it's going to be so transformative that is going to create tremendous opportunity. It scares me a little bit, but the opportunity is substantial.
Fantastic.
Dual-use technology.
Dual-use technology.
So you touch on that topic's morning session, the previous session. I think, as I said, so this is really a crucial timing. We redefine self-defense capability, and Mr. Kono, Ministry Kono, also mentioned about we are timing for the redefining for that. So TPD, Technology Prosperity Deal, so signed in the October last year, is a quite big moment for between Japan and the United States. They identified like 6 areas, right? AI, communication, biopharmacy, so on. So now, military application, we cannot define which one is military, which one is a civilian application. So it's very difficult. Drone, AI, some fabrics, materials, the semiconductor manufacturing, facilities and the components, so on. So we do have many choke point technology in Japan. And someone previous session mentioned about the Japanese manufacturing capability and the times US, really scale, speed, development capability, create really interesting, solution. Which can work both civilian application for the military application. And the US is $1.5 trillion in the budget for the defense budget.
Proposed budget hasn't been approved yet.
Yeah, sure. So Japan is increasing 2%, but it's less than 10 times more than Japanese budget. So I think the, accessing for those dual-use technology is, I think, essential. Japanese private enterprise, in terms of the growth, in terms of the obtaining new type of the product and solution.
So I think the biggest
Can I just add to that? I think the ultimate, dual-use economy is space, right? So I think is space.
Yeah, space is a part of that.
So
space is,
I didn't know you were such a space aficionado.
I'm not. That's so, but I'm fascinated.
Do you want to go up there?
No.
No. Right.
But I'd be happy
Biggest
to help
opportunity
people
for
build
somebody else.
No, oh, why?
Yes.
Right. This is like, you must have been trained by the Toyota Group. I think the biggest opportunity for Japan is the generational change. Japan is an unbelievably proud culture. Seniority matters. You don't upstage your senior, you gaman suru, and wait for him or her, mostly him, to retire and move on. The fact that the proud Japanese legacy, the Showa generation that built one of the greatest economic miracles, one of the great social systems in the universe, that generation is now retiring, is moving out, and making way for the next generation, for you people, to actually begin to take over. And you are unencumbered by the legacy of having created the economic miracle, right? When you look at corporate Japan, if you look not at the startup world, if you look at listed companies, the average age of the outgoing CEO over the last 18 months was 68 years old. And the average age of the new person coming in is 52. This is sayonara Showa. And as a result of that, you've got something where the proud corporate culture now is actually freed up from a lot of the legacy issues. So focusing on core competence, focusing on actually merging and industrial restructuring, that is the opportunity set that is led by a new generation of Japanese. Now, we're all emotionally opinionated about Mr. Trump and his style, right? But the reality of focusing on breaking ossified institutions, right, is actually correct. We've basically been now 3 generations after the last reset, after the Second World War, right? And it is clear that everywhere in the world, governments, government processes have been ossified and have multiplied, right? And what Elon Musk tried to do, right, with Dodge, again, the style is idiotic, right? Standing on stage with a chainsaw and promising $3 trillion and actually getting, what is it, $80 billion or something. I mean, it's obviously too much theatrics, but the overarching message of needing the public sector to begin to streamline, of needing to change the way the procurement structure of that big defense budget actually works, that it doesn't go just to 5 incumbents, right? But that it actually does open up to entrepreneurship, to startups. These are actually messages, right, that are very positive in terms of giving incentives to actually streamline and change the way the public sector, the way the government sector actually works, right, for the rest of the world. And I think, I'm very hopeful that Japan will actually start to embrace some of these things. Like, for example, I mentioned in the morning session, every discussion I have with policymakers about dual-use technology, about increased defense spending, the number one focus is to actually, how does this make Komatsu a better company? How does it make the startup community better? To actually ensure that the multipliers are starting to come through, changing the way of business as usual, giving greater opportunity to domestic companies. You're always first. Threats. Now don't say the magma downstairs.
I don't think I would have said this before coming to this summit, but I suppose this is really showing the bias of the last thing you heard. But after Richard Dasher's session on AI and kind of really thinking about the existential questions that were raised in that session for those of you who attended it, and about the relation, like rethinking the relationship we're going to have with AI, I think that there is a important threat in AI's development that I hadn't really thought about in the same way. And I believe in U.S. and Japan are always better together, and we should show leadership in the AI governance and AI safety. But I have a new appreciation for the urgency of that after the last session.
Right. Okay.
So it applies to both U.S. and Japan,
right.
Dual use.
So just in case anyone missed it, the example I had of the biggest opportunity was now the biggest threat. So that's really hurtful that you would do that to me, but I'm going to get over it. And to prove I'm over it, I'm going to copy your model of coming up with something that as a threat or an opportunity could be the same for both countries, which I thought was impressive, and I'm going to model your behavior, even though my feelings are hurt. And I'm not doing this because Jesper's here, but I think the biggest threat in the near term for both countries is Donald Trump. And the reason I say that, and by the way, I don't think it will be a problem in a few years, because I do, as I say, believe America will rise back up to some of our ideals through this tough time period. But the uncertainty, the chaos that we talked about earlier at such a powerful force in the global scale, and the moment for me that triggered this is, I mean, not that there haven't been a whole bunch of tweets that have been off-putting in the last several months in particular, but the ones about destroying a civilization and the concept of bragging about the sort of the power and the opportunity to take whatever you want if you have military power, I worry that could quickly sort of infiltrate the rest of the world and embolden other people who have aggressive perspectives that believe, just like Putin did with the Ukraine. And I think that normalization of that is very, very dangerous. So I think that is at a global level the biggest threat.
Right.
More threat is just in front of us, as I said initially. It's already, some of the mid-sized, small-sized company go bankrupt in the Southeast Asia. We realized huge vulnerability in terms of the self-sufficiency, especially for energy, even maybe in the future food. So threat is here, and I think for coming this year, I hope this will end, and Straits of Hormuz is going back to normal. But at least we have maybe 3-4 months. I cannot imagine. Like in Korea too. Korea is a quite difficult situation. Although they are, diversifying some of the raw materials from naphtha to other one, but still tough. India is really problem. So it's already threat is here because of, from me, unnecessary war.
Right.
I'm really angry. Yeah.
So it's wonderful to have the The Japanese are always fantastic in any panel discussion. You're especially fantastic because they're very pragmatic, right? Don't talk about the big stuff. Let's figure out, how to survive over the next, 3 to 6 months. And there is a very, very real threat, obviously, from the uncertainty and the real supply chain bottlenecks that are being built up, by that. To take it back from your practical level, from my perspective, the biggest threat in both countries is actually that in the name of national economic security, in the name of managing the supply side, the supply chains, that government interference and intervention actually gets bigger and begins to stifle competition. I will give you a concrete example. Many of you are aware that the Pentagon now has $200 billion of a venture fund to invest in dual-use technologies, both for listed and unlisted companies. These people sent a team, they're very smart, very good. They sent a team to Japan in early this year, and they looked specifically at 5 Japanese companies, who are significant players, but also as part of their business, do a component or a group of components where they've got 70–80% global market share, where those components, most of them sensors, right, are actually absolutely vital, for example, for drone technology, for military applications. The point I'm making is that these people wanted to buy or proposed to buy 5 to 10% of these listed companies' equities and have a seat on the board. Now, as a board member of a company like that, do I advise them to do that? Because that sensor, that component, is very nice and very good. And yes, I've got a dominant position in the whole thing. But am I going to reallocate my resources to just invest in that segment, even though it's not the most profitable segment and not the highest growth prospect segment? So this interference that we're getting of the government, both in the United States of America, you're buying Intel. Is that a good thing? Anyway, right? This interference that actually is going on is, in my opinion, a potential risk, right, to all of us, in the sense of that it can actually begin to stifle entrepreneurship, innovation, and most importantly, it builds up, or it risks building up, artificial monopolies or oligopolies that actually raise the barrier to entry for some of the innovative companies that are going on. And obviously, what is going on with one of the leading AI companies and them supposedly being excluded from government procurement is obviously the big high-level thing on what we're seeing there. No.
So how we can avoid this kind of force? It's all blockage of the region. It's happening, and U.S. increasing the defense budget a lot. All countries following that. Everybody talking about nuclear, and I said this is opportunity. They are use technology for Japanese private company. Although simultaneously, I'm saying that it's risk, as you mentioned. Yep. What we should do?
You're doing dual use. Talk to us.
That was a pretty tough question. But I guess I default perhaps to just really always seeing the importance of bringing the best of both of our countries together. And so, I think that Japan has a lot of capability. And I was thinking about earlier in one of the earlier sessions, when people were talking about Japan in a really positive way, but it was also like Japan is stable, Japan is steady, Japan is predictable, which are all great things. And you could kind of say, well, Japan is, in a little bit way boring that way. But I think that is really its strength. And so I think kind of leveraging that and bringing the innovation and the technology that come from the United States. But what I feel is that it's still really hard right now. because of some of this fragmentation we're seeing, countries around the world, including our countries, are increasingly focused on sovereign capabilities and kind of blocking each other out and not being open to the vulnerability that comes from sharing technology and building things together. And so I think to the extent we can try to, from the US perspective, think of Japan as a strategic growth market and not just an export market and as a customer, that's the kind of mindset that we should be building. I didn't answer the big global questions that you raised, but I think that's a perspective that I would bring to the conversation.
Right. Dan, what about you?
Which question?
What can we do to survive? No, but what?
Yeah, I mean, I do think this concept of finding commonality is important. And I think, we had this conversation earlier, and someone made the concept about the United States becoming very transactional, and it came up multiple times today. And I think that's true, but I don't think we've completely lost our sense of only the shortest of short-term transactions. And so I think if we find those commonality points, again, like the conversation about China, that I think Japan can leverage even more than the US can in our bilateral relationship, I think that's what we should look for. And I think technology partnerships, I think co-development economically are the things that tie us together to make smart joint decisions. And I think if we get out of the mindset of I'm trying to really win in the deal, this concept of trying to win in the deal versus to try to have both sides better off, which is sort of why international trade since the time of David Ricardo, that we've all understood that comparative advantage allows us to lift everyone if we focus on our strengths. I think that's there for us, and I think we can do that.
Again, what about from your perspective? And let me ask very specifically from your perspective. And now you run a global enterprise, with the Japan responsibility that you've got there. One or two things that Japan could do better.
In what sense? In what area?
In the world of football, because they can't just in the area of business in specific. What do you think? When you meet your colleagues, what are the two or three things that you would advise them to do to actually become a more resilient, more competitive corporation?
He's talking about your management, I think. He's coming at you pretty hard here. I think he wants to know what you could do better in running your company.
I'm closely working with Korea now because we originally started our operation in Japan from chewing gum business, but after that we expanded our business to Korea, and Korea is bigger than Japanese operation, but we are same company. So let me explain to our Japanese friend why I said quite loudly about dual-use technology, which is a little bit controversial. However, I said that because, for instance, in case of Korea, it's totally different angle. So they are technically still in the war against North Korea, and they have the K defense strategy, which is they will become number 4, military weapons and equipment supplier in the world. And then, Hyundai, those, kind of military-related company closely related with the government and, defense, and there's no line. Yep. And it's one of the, really driver for Korean chaebol, large enterprise for the innovation, so on. So I'm watching Korea, and I'm always talking with chairman, Tamatsuka-san, maybe Japan, Korea times 2, and then divide 2 is just a nice figure for the management. They are very fast.
Right.
So, and company, the government, company, academia, 3 triangle, and they work together, and then those are the strategic field. We go to K defense, semiconductor, bio, burn, very fast. I think from Japanese point of view, that's too risky. It's not only 70% preparation. It doesn't work that way. All Japanese worry about that, but just they go. So I think Japan can improve, increase in speed, more decisive leadership, consensus-based management decision making is good, but for really critical timing, we should imply, those kind of things. Maybe we can be better.
So it's very interesting, Gen's point about Japan and Korea, some of the differences there. But I actually think as a litmus test for the world going forward, a fractured world, and middle powers building alliances. Now, obviously, Japan reaching out to Britain, to Italy, to develop a joint fighter project, right? It's all very nice. But for Indo-Pacific, right? We've had a very, very strong, multidimensional US-Japan relationship that is going strong for all intents and purposes. But the real question, or the real litmus test, in my opinion, of whether the world actually, weans itself off the United States of America for Indo-Pacific actually lies between Japan and Korea. If you've got competition, right? In terms of now the new growth sector, the defense industry, where Japan is envious of Korea's success, and METI wants to basically take them on and compete with them, whether that evolves into a cooperative structure or whether that is just a competitive structure is, I think, going to be a great senkoshisu, like a big, what is it called, like a canary in the coal mine, right? Telling us whether Indo-Pacific middle powers are actually weaning themselves off the United States of America or not. So we shall see. Final fire round question, right? Any advice for business leaders, entrepreneurs, investors, in terms of the opportunity set outside of dual-use technology, because that's now very obvious, right? Any advice? Oh, you're going to say space, right? But in all seriousness, like, what are you looking at? What is the advice? Where are the concrete investment and business opportunities outside of dual use?
Well, I work on a fund that's focused on dual use in space technology. So you just took those away from me. So I think that I want to just say dual use again. I know you said I can't, but I just really do think that that's really important. So I'm going to, and I think that the areas of sort of physical AI, autonomy, robotics, really do require looking at opportunities. First of all, for the companies to be successful, there's opportunities in both markets. But I think really kind of fundamentally, we are at a point where it's not as easy to distinguish what is commercial, what is security, what is government, what is military, what is defense uses. And we're in that kind of gray zone area right now in a lot of different ways where we can't actually distinguish. So I think that hopefully with Japan, and this is a mostly Japanese business audience, being more open to thinking about these technologies in a more flexible way is very, very important so those technologies can scale and service.
Great. Dan, where are you going to put your money?
I've got two. One small little thing we can all do, and one thing that's maybe more specific to our companies that's more direct. The small little thing is appreciation. I think finding connection points. When I was a young man, I had an exchange student from Japan, and it opened up a lifelong interest in the country. And I think doing things like that where you connect with people and build some of those relationships, even if it's one little small thing that you do, I think it's amazing how the ripples, go forward on that. So I would encourage us all to do that. On the very specific thing for businesses, I do think it's trying to figure out how to leverage the expertise and technologies that each side have. I'm flying to Tokyo next week to go to a board meeting for a Japanese company. And while there's certain things that I think I'm not helpful about in helping that company be successful, there's other things I think my experience as an American business person are really valuable. And I think it's the same thing with technologies. One thing I would tell you I'd like to see more of, there's a lot of retail things in Japan that when you're an American and you go to Japan and you're like, why is the food better here? Why is the 7-Eleven food better than most restaurants that are expensive in the US? Like, how does that happen? that does seem like that should be exportable. And so I would say that I would love to see more of those Japanese cultural things. We have some for little girls, but we don't have enough that go beyond, Hello Kitty. We need more things that are the global power of those. So I'd look for those.
So it's very cool. I was with the 7-Eleven board a couple of weeks ago, and they now, in terms of AI, right? And, of course, as a German, you want to talk the big picture stuff, how it's all going to kill us or it's all going to save us. And they say, well, cut the crap. Sorry, they're Japanese. It was a bit more polite, right? Basically, cut the bullshit. We've set up an AI project to improve the quality of our egg sandwich. And now, as you know, the egg sandwich at 7-Eleven is already the best egg sandwich in the bloody universe, but now AI is going to make it even better. So I love the practicality that Japan brings to the table.
Totally different topic.
Totally different.
Totally different topic. Because of AI, I believe real experience, real event, real sports, the value for that will be increased because there are so many fake, movies, fake videos, so on, and people have more excess time because the productivity increased. So they have more time for enjoying sports, watching music, so on. So Lotte has 2 professional baseball teams, Chiba Lotte Marines and Busan Lotte Giants. Very unique, although now is a little bit struggling, however. And I'm the chairman for the professional rugby league. So I think the real sports content has a huge potential. And in the United States, very good at monetize that. It's really good. So
Think about that one idea. Can we make it? Have you ever heard of Lucky Fest?
yeah.
We could export Lucky Fest to the U.S.
I forced to sponsor that.
That's the Lucky Fest is the answer.
Music event too. Last week we had a Deep Purple. Deep Purple, you know Deep Purple, right? They're from England, but the lead vocal is 80 years old. But the concert ticket sold out only few seconds. Oasis came last year. Totally sold out very quickly. So why? The young people coming in, they want to watch real one.
So it's so interesting, right? I'll tell you a
I
person.
really want to learn from United States for entertainment, sports management. So I'm visiting the baseball team, so many baseball teams, because we are planning to set up the new stadium, totally new stadium. So many innovation going on. Dodger Stadium is really great. Yeah. So many
I'm going to tell you a personal anecdote before we open it up for questions. So when I got this fellowship to go to Japan, I really didn't know where Japan was. But fortunately, Hopkins University had a guy from METI, right? And so I said, okay, well, fine. We got to go out. You got to teach me something about Japan. And so we go to a sushi bar and we drink a lot and have a good time. And he explains to me how Japan works. And then at the end, we go out slightly inebriated. He has to go left. I have to go right. We go. And then he comes running back. And he goes, Kodo-san, I forgot most important thing. We Japanese, we love our body. And so I said, wow, you love your body? So I was like, oh my God, is he gay? Is that how they do this in Japan? I'm like, And to your point, right, sensorial pleasures, the sensorial delights, gokan, right, the 5 senses and possibly the 6th sense, right? Stimulating all of those, the Japanese are the absolute master at the whole thing. You mentioned Korea. I was with Takaichi, and I told her, it's like all this focus on quantum computing and AI, all this Me Too stuff, because there's not a country in the world that isn't doing this stuff, right? Instead, Korea, right, 7 years ago, what was the Korean industrial growth strategy? It was music, films. The third one? Cosmetic surgery.
Skincare. Oh, skincare.
Exactly. But soft power. We know Japan has incredible soft power. There is an enormous amount of, discrimination, fragmentation, non-consolidation, lack of venture capital funding to the whole thing. So I think, again, how about you and I cooperating and we set up the Japan Bodily Pleasures Fund?
Why not?
I think it'd be a big seller. Question and answers. Now, remember, Do you remember the German rules, Glenn? 30 seconds. If there's no question in 30 seconds, a bottle of champagne, and none of this cheap German stuff, a bottle of champagne for all of the panelists. Please, any questions, comments? Daisuke. Daisuke, by the way, is a drummer who is open for bookings in the Silicon Valley area.
Thank you. So I believe for a business leader, to think about the future is important. So let's imagine the topic of the G1 conference 2036, 10 years from now. So what will the team look like? So what will you want to discuss in the future conference?
Okay, the theme in 10 years' time. What do you think are the big issues we'll be talking about? Anybody wants to take that?
Space.
Okay, not the Strait of, and if it's still the Strait of Hormuz, we have a problem.
I can't beat that.
I was going to say egg salad sandwiches because I can't wait to see how they can be improved.
I mean, it's very interesting, right? I think that, so one of the, as you know, there's a lot of economics working about the displacement or the potential displacement by AI, right, of white-collar workers, right? And there's different estimates. You can think about this, and it's not easy economics to do because there's always marginal substitution, and you don't know how much it's going to be, et cetera, right? But I think in 10 years' time, right? The issue, what I think that Japan as the model economy, where the combination of the Jinko Gensho, of the fact that you are having a declining population, at exactly the time that we've got a tool of technology that actually allows the penetration into the service sector, right? Now, I'm not waiting for my diapers in an old folks' home to be changed by a robot, but the possibility of this actually happening without replacing labor in Japan is way higher than it is in the United States, than it is anywhere else in the world. So I think that this evolution of Japan as the model economy and this realization that the decline in population is actually not a threat or a risk to economic growth, and more importantly, to the welfare of the nation, that it's actually an opportunity because the risk of technology replacing humans, and as a result of that amplifying social divide, social problems. I mean, it's not, you have serious economists predicting the US unemployment rate will rise to 10, 12%, right? So we shall see, but I think that in 10 years' time, Japan as the model economy, I think that argument is going to be very stronger, and you will have a Japanese business leader who is optimistic about Japan rather than always focusing on, the glass is not half full, the glass is not half empty. It was actually one of my professors in Japan gave me that advice. The glass is not half full, it's not half empty. The only question relevant is whether you can fill it up, which is all for you. Now, any other question, comment from anybody? Hori-san.
Well, I have a question to Dan or Suzanne. We talked about chaos and unpredictability of the U.S. top president. And it seems like a private sector is not voicing out enough. And if that happened to Japan, private sectors will speak up and it will take the governance to the prime minister. And why not? And then I know that private sectors are afraid about retaliation again from the president, but don't you think you should do more to change the course of the U.S. because only the U.S. citizens, the private sector, can change the course of president?
It's a great question. My answer would be fiduciary responsibility. I think the leaders have never had anything like this to deal with before, and they realize their responsibility to their companies and their shareholders means they should try to find the way to best navigate. And I think we've always said you need to navigate, the government. And it never before was the government really embodied as one individual, and that's why we have these actions. And it's actually, if you think about the story you told about the cherry trees of the visiting gift, we never spent a lot of time, foreign nations didn't think, what do I need to do to sort of bribe the President of the United States when I show up to curry favor? And so I think it's unprecedented, and I think they don't know what to do. I think it's at a loss because they know their responsibility to their employees and their shareholders. So they're just saying, I'm going to suck it up and try to get through these next few years. It's not a heartening answer.
Suzanne.
I really don't have anything to add to that. It's just, it's a tough question, and you can extend the question to, normal citizens. And, what are we, what can people do if they don't like what they're seeing? And there is a sense of powerlessness right now in our country. And so I think people are putting a lot of hopes into seeing a sense of change at the midterms. But there's still a lot of uncertainty. So there's no great answers for that one, unfortunately.
It's very interesting, right? I mean, when I ask the similar sort of questions, right, I get two responses, right? And the first one is that, look, he was elected by the majority of the Americans, and we've got to respect this democratic process. It's so, and that's like, wow, that's very impressive, very American. I think the litmus test is going to come after the midterms. I mean, we shall see whatever the outcome is going to be, but whether the American pendulum, right, really the balance of power, which we all think, makes America great, whether that actually starts to work, whether you will get corporate leaders rallying behind whoever the Democratic Party is going to allow to compete, to become president. So I think that we should never, ever underestimate the self-correcting mechanism that the American system has, right? Yes, it's swung very, very far on one side of the pendulum right now, including with a character who has no soul and has lost any claim to moral leadership, right? So we'll see where the pendulum is going to swing. So I think the verdict on that is still going to be out. Any additional question? Yes, young lady.
It's not a question. Japan's opportunity. You mentioned about how tasty the 7-Eleven's egg salad sandwiches are, how great Japanese baseball games are. But I think where the potential is, Japan's pricing or monetization strategy, I think that's something that we can learn a lot from American, strategy. And I think Globus, has MBA, great MBA programs, and then MBA is not as prevailed here in Japan, or there in Japan as here. But besides that, the leadership education, monetization, or commercialization, or pricing strategy, what do you think about this, and how can we improve, that growth potential there?
Great, fantastic. Anybody? Sensei.
You mean we are selling very cheap? Or? Okay. So we had a very lengthy deflationary period, more than 30 years. That was end about 3-4 years ago. So, but up to that timing, we never done the price increase. So we are working Lotte. I'm working for Lotte. Since 3-4 years ago, we started price increase. Initially, all salespeople rejected. Oh, no, we cannot do that. We cannot do that to 7-Eleven. We cannot do that to Lawson. Yeah. However, now it's already, gradual inflation already, and the people already adjusted. So wage for Lotte, so 3 continuous years, we have the base, increase, which is maybe unique for United States, but we really have base up, base increase 6%. 3 years continuously, and maybe this year again 6%. So the wage has been increasing, the consumer index CPI is increasing, and we already get used to the price hike, and the client also is already can accept the price hike. So I think it will be changing, and in addition to that, the Japanese aggregate corporate operating margin has been improving in the past 10 years because of the corporate governance, because of the outside directors coming in. We have the friendly activists from your country. So those pressure are it works. It's improving. So 10 years ago, that was only 2-3%. Now 7%. Still low compared to your country. However, it's improving. So corporate governance, right strategy, we are inflation mode. I think we are now changing.
So it's interesting. The fundamental reason is Japan's industrial structure, right? Japan has too many companies competing in too many businesses and has supported over the last 25 years official policy from the LDP to support zombie companies, right? 12% of all listed companies do not cover their interest expense out of profits, which given that interest rates have been zero, is actually quite difficult to do. Right? Of all lending in Japan, there's about 400 trillion yen of corporate loans. The Bank of Japan has 255 trillion yen of loans. And the Bank of Japan basically lends to you because you're a zombie. Preserving the structure. Another data, 25 years, 30 years ago, in the US, there were 8,000 companies. Today, there is 4,000 listed companies. In Japan, 30 years ago, there were 2,000 listed companies. Now, there is 4,000 listed companies. Many of the IPOs done are, I'm sorry to say, zombie companies that don't have a functioning business model, right? You see that. I mean, you know, I run a personal fund. Every time there's an IPO in Japan, after 10 days, I short the company. It's a wonderful fund, trust me, extremely high performance. You know all of this issue of excess competition because of zombie companies. So the interesting thing about Takaichi is that she understands this issue very well. Every time I have a conversation with her, she asks me, does Japan need 7 car companies? And the answer is no. Japan does not need 7 car companies. And by the way, merging Honda and Nissan is like tying 2 drowning men together and expecting them to swim better. For all intents and purposes, these companies do not have a business model that is globally competitive, right? It's quite interesting that you actually have this, but the recognition of creating national champions. And your point about the fact that we do have governance changes, we now do have generational change, where you've got Denso Corporation, cut loose by Toyota, now buying Rome, potentially taking on Toshiba as well, to actually get to scale at power chip manufacturing, and that part of the car industry is super exciting. One final, sorry, I like data, right? The most bullish point about Japan, right, is the fact that last year, 7.1% of all listed companies got a takeover bid. This was basically zero. Every once in a while, Sumitomo Corp would buy in a sub, right? But it's basically nothing. The market for corporate control, because of this generational change of CEOs being open, it's one thing to have an activist. The other thing is to actually engage with the activist and actually start to do something about the pressure. And of course, there's a lot of private equity money that is now available to actually help taking company private, to actually help, you know, doing mergers and acquisitions. So I think these forces coming together, and my prediction to you will be that in 10 years' time, when we're going to meet, that there will not be 4,000 listed companies, but there will be only 2,000 listed companies, and half of them will provide the best egg sandwiches on Earth. And the other half will be in space.
Although I would just relieve there's one positive thing about the pricing, which is income inequality. And so one of the things that Japan has benefited compared to other countries, particularly the US, is having less income inequality because of that price differential. So even though I agree with you, there's a balance, there's an extreme, don't go too fast because you don't want to end up in the situation where you get political instability, which we have because of that.
Thank you very much to the panelists, right? You were very dynamic. SWOT analysis, space, you know, everything we talked about. I want to thank, you know, the audience for being with us, for asking questions, and for not asking questions. You were very close to the 30-second rule, and we were all looking forward to the bottle of champagne, but that's okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.